In 1991, a seismologist working for the United States Geological Survey installed a network of portable monitoring stations along a remote stretch of the San Andreas Fault in central California. The stations were designed to measure ground motion, micro tremors too small to feel, shifts in the bedrock that might signal the slow buildup of stress before a larger event. Over the next 3 decades, those stations captured exactly what they were designed to capture. But the field notebooks the seismologist kept alongside the official data contained something else entirely. Handwritten entries, dated and precise, documenting reports of anomalous vocalizations in the surrounding wilderness that seemed to cluster in the days before significant seismic activity. He tracked this pattern privately for 30 years. He never published it. He never told his colleagues. He collected the data with the same rigor he applied to everything else in his career, filed it in a fireproof cabinet in his garage, and said nothing because the correlation he was documenting connected a legitimate geophysical phenomenon to a subject that would have ended his career the moment he spoke it out loud. His name was Ward Torrance. He carried a USGS badge for 34 years. He retired in 2021 with a spotless professional record, 211 published contributions to seismic monitoring databases, and a filing cabinet containing evidence that no peer-reviewed journal would touch. What he documented and what he has finally agreed to discuss suggests that something living along the San Andreas corridor has been responding to seismic precursors for far longer than modern instruments have been measuring them. And the pattern, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. Ward grew up in Hollister, California, a small city that sits almost directly on top of the San Andreas Fault in San Benito County. The fault runs through the eastern side of town with such geographic precision that there is a stretch of road near Dunn Park where the curb on one side has shifted several inches from the curb on the other side due to aseismic creep, the slow, continuous movement of the plates that happens without any detectable earthquake. Ward's father was a cattleman who ran about 200 head on a spread east of town, land that butted up against the Temblor Range and the dry golden hills that separate the Salinas Valley from the San Joaquin. Ward grew up watching his father read the land the way other people read newspapers, tracking groundwater levels, watching how cattle behaved before weather changes, noting when the well water turned cloudy, which sometimes happened days before a tremor, strong enough to rattle dishes in the kitchen. His father was not a superstitious man. He was a practical one who understood that the earth beneath his feet was alive in ways that most people never had to think about. Ward absorbed that awareness before he had language for it. If this type of investigative content is something you value, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. It costs nothing and it helps more than you might think. After high school, Ward attended the University of California at Santa Cruz, where he studied earth sciences and discovered that the intuitive understanding of ground behavior he had inherited from his father had a name: seismology. He went on to earn a master's degree at Caltech, where he specialized in fault mechanics and the emerging field of earthquake precursor research, the effort to identify measurable signals that might predict seismic events before they occurred. This was the late 1970s, and precursor research was an optimistic discipline. Scientists believed they were on the verge of reliable earthquake prediction. China had successfully evacuated the city of Haicheng in 1975 based on a combination of precursor signals, foreshock sequences, groundwater anomalies, and notably, anomalous animal behavior. The Haicheng prediction saved thousands of lives and seemed to validate a multi-signal approach that included biological indicators alongside geophysical ones. That optimism would not last. The field of earthquake prediction suffered a series of failures through the 1980s and 90s that eroded institutional confidence. By the time Ward joined the USGS in 1987, the agency had shifted from active prediction toward probabilistic hazard assessment, and the biological component of precursor research, the animal behavior observations that had been part of the Chinese model, was quietly abandoned as anecdotal. Ward understood why. Animal behavior is influenced by dozens of variables. Isolating a seismic signal from that noise required the kind of long-term observation that institutional science was not structured to support. Grants ran on 3 to 5 year cycles. Tenure committees valued publication frequency, but Ward, who had watched his father's cattle cluster against the barn wall 12 hours before a 4.3 tremor when he was 9 years old, never fully accepted the consensus that biological precursors were worthless. He just learned not to say so. Ward spent the first 4 years of his USGS career based in Menlo Park, working on the Parkfield earthquake experiment, one of the most ambitious prediction efforts in American seismology. The town of Parkfield sits on the San Andreas Fault, about midway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, in a section where moderate earthquakes had occurred at remarkably regular intervals, roughly every 22 years. The USGS had installed a dense network of instruments around Parkfield in the 1980s, hoping to capture the precursor signals of the next moderate earthquake in real time. It was the most heavily monitored section of fault on Earth, and Ward's job was to maintain field instrumentation and analyze data from portable seismometers deployed across the surrounding rangeland. The Parkfield assignment put Ward exactly where the story begins, not because of what the seismometers recorded, but because of what he heard in the field while servicing them. In October of 1991, Ward was camped overnight near Cholame Valley, about 8 miles southeast of Parkfield, at a location where he had placed a portable broadband seismometer to supplement the permanent network during a period of elevated microseismicity. The site was remote, accessible only by a dirt ranch road that wound up through scrub oak and dry grass into a canyon that opened onto a ridgeline overlooking the fault trace. Ward had camped at this site and others like it dozens of times. He was comfortable alone in the backcountry. He knew the sounds of the Diablo Range at night, the coyotes, the great horned owls, the occasional mountain lion scream that carried for miles in the still air. At approximately 1:45 in the morning, Ward was awakened by a sound he could not identify. His first thought was that a coyote had gotten unusually close to camp, but as he lay in his sleeping bag listening, the sound failed to resolve into anything recognizable. It was a vocalization, clearly biological, but with a depth and resonance that did not match any animal he knew. The sound had a tonal quality, almost musical, with a fundamental frequency so low that Ward could feel it in his sternum as much as hear it with his ears. It lasted approximately 15 seconds, paused, and repeated. Then a second voice joined from a different direction, perhaps a quarter mile to the north, producing a similar but distinct vocalization. The two sounds overlapped briefly, then both stopped. The silence that followed was total. No coyotes, no owls, nothing. Ward lay awake for the rest of the night. He did not go outside. He did not turn on his flashlight. He was not afraid exactly, but something about the quality of those sounds triggered a response in his nervous system that he recognized as the same flat alertness his father's cattle displayed before ground movement, a stillness that was not calm, a waiting. 37 hours later, a 4.1 magnitude earthquake occurred on the Parkfield segment of the San Andreas, centered less than 12 miles from where Ward had been camped. He noted the coincidence in his field journal but did not assign it significance. Coincidences happen. The fault was active. Animals vocalize for many reasons. He wrote it down and moved on, but he kept writing things down. That was Ward's nature and his training. He was a man who believed that data accumulated toward understanding even when individual data points seemed meaningless. Over the following months, as he continued fieldwork across the Parkfield area and expanded into the Carrizo Plain and the Temblor Range to the south, he began systematically noting any unusual auditory observations during overnight deployments. He was not looking for a pattern. He was simply recording what he heard, the same way he recorded barometric pressure and ground temperature and instrument readings, because that was what field scientists did. By the spring of 1992, he had 4 entries in his field journal describing vocalizations that he could not attribute to known wildlife. 2 near Cholame, 1 in the Carrizo Plain near Soda Lake, and 1 in the Temblor Range east of Taft. All had occurred during nighttime hours. All shared similar acoustic characteristics, deep, resonant, tonal, with a complexity that felt structured rather than random. And 3 of the 4 had been followed within 72 hours by measurable seismic events on the San Andreas or associated faults. 3 out of 4 is a ratio that a statistician would call meaningless in such a small sample. Ward knew that, but he also knew something about the locations where these vocalizations occurred that gave him pause. They were not random points on a map. They were all within what seismologists call the fault damage zone, the band of fractured, deformed rock that flanks the main fault trace. This zone extends anywhere from a few hundred yards to several miles on either side of the primary rupture surface, and it behaves differently from the surrounding intact bedrock. It transmits certain types of seismic waves differently. It responds to changes in underground fluid pressure differently, and it produces subtle changes in the local geomagnetic field, ground gas emissions, and groundwater chemistry in the hours and days before significant fault movement. Ward understood the geophysics. What he did not understand was what was producing the sounds. He had considered and eliminated the obvious candidates, not coyotes whose vocalizations he could identify in his sleep, not mountain lions whose screams, while startling, had a distinctive quality that bore no resemblance to what he was hearing, not owls, not elk, not feral cattle. The vocalizations did not match any species in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's acoustic database, which Ward accessed through a colleague at Sacramento State, who ran a bioacoustic monitoring program in the Sierra Nevada. In June of 1992, Ward drove north to San Benito County to visit his father, who was 71 and still running the ranch alone since Ward's mother had passed 3 years earlier. They sat on the porch after dinner, as they always did, and Ward asked his father a question he had been turning over in his mind for months. He asked whether the old man had ever heard unusual sounds in the Diablo Range at night, sounds that did not match the regular wildlife. His father was quiet for a long time. Then he said yes. He said he had heard them off and on for more than 40 years, always at night, always from the hills east of the ranch, always in the fall or winter when the range was quiet and the cattle were brought in close. He described them as low howls with a pattern to them, like something calling and something answering. He said most of the ranchers in the area had heard them at one time or another, and most of them attributed the sounds to coyotes or wind or the general strangeness of living on a fault line. But his father said there was one thing about the sounds that he had never told anyone because it made him sound crazy. He said the sounds came before the shaking. Not always. Not reliably enough to set your watch by, but often enough that over 40 years of paying attention, he had come to associate those particular vocalizations with ground movement that followed within a day or two. He said he had mentioned it once to a veterinarian in Hollister in the 1960s, and the vet had looked at him like he was simple, so he never brought it up again. Ward sat on that porch and felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of what he had been documenting, not literally, figuratively, because what his father was describing was not a new observation. It was a generational one. It extended the potential timeline of the correlation he was tracking from months to decades. He drove back to Menlo Park that weekend and made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of his private research. He would maintain 2 parallel records. His official USGS field notes would contain everything the agency expected: instrument readings, calibration logs, deployment coordinates, weather observations, standard fauna sightings. His personal notebooks, identical Moleskine journals that he purchased by the box, would contain everything else: the vocalizations, the timing, the correlation with subsequent seismic events, the geographic clustering along the fault damage zone, everything that the institutional framework could not accommodate. He told no one, not his supervisor, not his colleagues at the Earthquake Science Center, not the woman he was dating at the time, a hydrologist named Vicky Osgood, who worked in the USGS Water Resources Division and who would become his wife in 1994. Vicky knew Ward kept personal field notes. She had her own version of the habit, but she did not know what was in them. That separation would persist for 27 years, and it would cost Ward something he could not have predicted when he started. Through the 1990s, Ward's official career flourished. He contributed to the instrumentation of additional fault segments, built a reputation as one of the most meticulous field seismologists in the Western region, and became the kind of scientist the USGS valued most: reliable, precise, and trusted. And he was documenting something in his personal notebooks that would have destroyed every bit of that trust had anyone known. By 2000, Ward had accumulated 9 years of personal records, 47 entries describing unidentified vocalizations during overnight field deployments. Of those 47, 31 had been followed by measurable seismic events within 72 hours. The correlation rate was 66%. Ward was disciplined enough to know what the number did not prove. Coincidence amplified by confirmation bias remained a possibility. The pattern was suggestive. It was not proof. And the moment he tried to explain what was producing the vocalizations, the pattern would collapse under professional ridicule, regardless of its statistical merit. Because he knew what was producing the sounds. He had known since 1995, when something happened during a field deployment in the Carrizo Plain that removed any remaining ambiguity about the source. The Carrizo Plain is one of the most geologically significant landscapes in California. It is a long, dry valley between the Temblor Range and the Caliente Range in eastern San Luis Obispo County, and the San Andreas Fault runs through it with textbook visibility. The plain is largely undeveloped, a national monument managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and in certain stretches the fault trace is so clearly expressed in the terrain that you can see the offset of stream beds and ridgelines with your naked eye. The land looks like someone grabbed the surface of the earth with both hands and slid one side past the other, which is essentially what happened. The Carrizo Plain is also remote in a way that most Californians do not associate with their state. No cell service, no permanent residence for miles. Pronghorn antelope and kit foxes and Tule elk and vast empty grassland that shimmers with heat in summer and freezes hard in winter. At night, the darkness is absolute. The nearest artificial lights 15 miles away. In November of 1995, Ward was on the plain for a week-long deployment, installing upgraded broadband seismometers at 3 sites along the fault trace as part of the Southern California Earthquake Center's continuous monitoring expansion. He was working alone, which he preferred for installations that required precise calibration in quiet conditions. He camped near his truck at each site, cooking on a small propane stove, sleeping in the truck bed under a canvas canopy he had rigged years earlier. On the 4th night, November 9th, he was camped at the most remote of the 3 sites, a location about 3 miles off the main dirt road, accessible only by a faint track that crossed two dry washes. The nearest maintained road was 11 miles east. He had finished dinner and was reviewing calibration data on his laptop, the screen casting a blue glow across the truck bed when the first sound reached him. It came from the southwest, from the direction of the fault trace itself, which ran across the plain about 400 yards from his camp. Low, resonant, unmistakable. The same deep tonal vocalization he had been documenting for 4 years, but louder this time, closer. He estimated the source at no more than 300 yards. He shut the laptop and listened in the dark. The vocalization lasted approximately 20 seconds, dropped in pitch, paused, and resumed at a slightly different frequency. Then a second source answered from the northwest, farther away, perhaps half a mile. The two voices overlapped for several seconds before both fell silent. Ward sat motionless in his truck bed, breathing through his nose, heart rate elevated but controlled. He had a flashlight within reach and a can of bear spray in the cab of the truck, though the Carrizo plane had no bears. He did not reach for either. He waited. 11 minutes later, the nearer source vocalized again. This time, Ward noticed something he had not registered in previous encounters. The sound had harmonics, not just a single fundamental tone, but layered overtones that gave it a richness, a dimensionality that sounded almost like a chord being struck rather than a single note being sustained. He had training in acoustic analysis from a short course he had taken at Stanford in the early 90s, and his ear told him that whatever was producing this sound had a vocal apparatus capable of generating multiple simultaneous frequencies. That was not a coyote. That was not an owl. That was not wind through a canyon. That was a large animal with a chest cavity big enough to produce fundamental frequencies below 100 hertz and a laryngeal structure complex enough to support harmonic overtones. Then he heard footsteps, not the light, rapid footfalls of a coyote or fox. Heavy, measured bipedal impacts on the dry ground, spaced at intervals that suggested a stride of roughly 4.5 to 5 feet. The footsteps approached from the southwest, from the direction of the nearer vocalization source, and they were heading toward his camp. Ward's training told him to stay still and observe. His body told him to start the truck. He compromised by reaching slowly into the cab and retrieving his flashlight, a heavy-duty mag light that doubled as a reasonable defensive tool. The footsteps stopped. He estimated the distance at roughly 150 yards, just beyond the effective range of his flashlight in open terrain. The silence lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the vocalization resumed, but different now, shorter, sharper. 3 rapid low barks followed by a sustained tone that dropped and faded. From the northwest, the second source responded with a similar pattern. 3 barks, sustained tone, fade. Ward sat in the truck bed with the flashlight in his hand and understood, with a clarity that he would later describe as the most unsettling moment of his professional life, that he was listening to a coordinated exchange between 2 large bipedal beings positioned on either side of his camp along the trace of the San Andreas Fault. They knew he was there. They were communicating about him, and they were doing it with vocalizations that demonstrated structure, turn-taking, and apparent semantic content beyond what any known North American wildlife could produce. He did not turn on the flashlight. He sat in the dark and listened as the exchange continued for another 7 or 8 minutes. The 2 sources calling back and forth with variations in pitch, duration, and rhythmic pattern that suggested a conversation rather than a display. Then the nearer source vocalized one final time, a long, low tone that faded into the dark, and the footsteps resumed, this time receding to the southwest. The second source went silent. Within 5 minutes, the ambient sounds of the plain returned. Coyotes yipping in the middle distance, a burrowing owl calling from somewhere to the east. Ward slept in the cab of his truck that night with the doors locked, which he had never done in hundreds of nights camping alone in the field. He did not record the incident in his official field notes. He wrote it in the Moleskine, 3 pages. Every detail he could remember, including the estimated timing, direction, distance, acoustic characteristics, stride length, and the behavioral pattern of the exchange. At the bottom of the 3rd page, he wrote something that was not data and not analysis, but was the most honest thing in 34 years of scientific documentation. He wrote, "I know what these are. I have known for some time. I do not know what to do with that knowledge." 41 hours later, a 3.8 magnitude earthquake occurred on the Carrizo segment of the San Andreas, centered approximately 9 miles northwest of Ward's camp. The correlation held. Over the next decade, Ward refined his methodology without ever formalizing it into a research protocol, because formalizing it would have required telling someone what he was studying. He developed a standardized notation system for the Moleskine entries, coding each vocalization event with location coordinates, estimated distance and direction to the sound source, acoustic characteristics including estimated fundamental frequency and duration, ambient conditions, and the time and magnitude of any subsequent seismic event within a 72-hour window. He maintained separate logs for what he called null events, seismic occurrences within his study area that were not preceded by observed vocalizations, and blank events, vocalizations that were not followed by measurable seismicity. The null events were frequent. He spent most of his time at a desk in Menlo Park, not in the field, so he missed far more potential observations than he captured. The blank events were less common but present. Roughly a third of all vocalization entries had no associated seismicity within the 72-hour window, but the positive correlations continued to accumulate at a rate that, by any honest assessment, exceeded what chance alone would predict. By 2005, Ward had 112 vocalization entries spanning 14 years. 74 of those, 66%, showed a positive correlation with subsequent seismicity. The consistency of the percentage across growing sample sizes was itself noteworthy. In a dataset driven by coincidence, you would expect the correlation to decay toward baseline as the sample grew. It did not. It held at 66% from the first 50 entries through the first 100, as steady as a heartbeat. Ward began to explore the geophysical mechanisms that might explain the correlation, working the problem from the earthquake side rather than the biological side, because the earthquake side was the one he could think about without his stomach tightening. He knew that in the hours and days before significant fault movement, a cascade of measurable changes occurs in the rock and groundwater near the fault trace. Micro-fracturing of stressed rock generates low-frequency electromagnetic signals. Radon gas emissions increase as fractures open new pathways through the crust. Groundwater levels fluctuate as aquifer geometry shifts under changing stress. The piezoelectric effect in quartz-bearing rock produces weak electrical fields, and infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, propagates through the ground and into the atmosphere as the fault zone deforms. Any or all of these precursor signals could theoretically be detectable by a large animal with sufficiently sensitive physiology. Infrasound detection, in particular, was well documented in several species. Elephants communicate and detect environmental events through infrasound. Certain birds are believed to use infrasound to navigate and to detect approaching storms. Whales produce and respond to infrasound across ocean basins. If a large ground-dwelling species in the San Andreas corridor had evolved sensitivity to the infrasonic signatures of tectonic stress, the behavioral response Ward was documenting made perfect sense. The vocalizations were not random. They were alarm calls, territorial announcements, preparation signals. Whatever these creatures were doing before earthquakes, they were doing it because they could feel what was coming in a way that human bodies could not. They were reading the earth the way Ward's father read his cattle, the way the cattle read the ground, except they were doing it at a level of sensitivity and specificity that made human instrumentation look crude by comparison. That realization hit Ward during a long drive across the San Joaquin Valley in the summer of 2006, and he had to pull over to the shoulder of Interstate 5 and sit with his hands on the wheel until the implications finished rearranging themselves in his mind. Because what it meant was that these creatures were not incidental occupants of the fault zone. They were adapted to it. Their presence along the San Andreas was not accidental any more than a salmon's presence in a river was accidental. They were there because the fault was there. Their biology, their behavior, their territorial distribution, all of it was shaped by a geological feature that ran 750 miles through the state of California, and that meant they had been there for a very long time. Not decades, not centuries. The kind of biological adaptation Ward was hypothesizing took thousands of years at minimum. These beings had been living along the San Andreas Fault, sensing its movements, responding to its rhythms, for timescales that predated every human settlement in the region. He sat on the shoulder of Interstate 5 with trucks roaring past and the heat shimmering off the asphalt and thought about the Yokuts. The Yokuts were the indigenous people whose territory encompassed the southern San Joaquin Valley and the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada, including the eastern edge of the Carrizo Plain. Ward had encountered references to Yokuts oral traditions in regional history texts while researching the cultural context of the Parkfield area. Several Yokuts bands had traditions describing large, hair-covered beings that lived in the mountains and foothills, and that were associated with the Earth's movements. One account, preserved in an ethnographic collection at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, described beings called by a name that translated roughly as the ones who feel the ground, and stated that when these beings called out at night, the earth would shake soon after. The Yokuts regarded this as factual observation, not mythology. They had been documenting the same correlation Ward had independently discovered, and they had been doing it for centuries before the USGS existed. Ward drove to Berkeley the following weekend and spent 3 days in the Bancroft Library reading everything he could find about indigenous accounts of the San Andreas region. What he found confirmed and expanded the pattern. The Chumash, whose territory included the transverse ranges where the San Andreas bends east toward the Mojave, had traditions describing a massive being that lived in the earth and whose movements caused trembling. The Selenian people of the Central Coast described nocturnal beings in the mountains that sang before the land moved. The Esalen of the Big Sur region had accounts of deep voices from the hills that preceded what they called the Earth's anger. Across hundreds of miles and multiple distinct cultural groups, the same observation recurred. Large beings, nocturnal vocalizations, followed by ground movement. The indigenous peoples of the San Andreas corridor had been living with this knowledge for millennia. They had encoded it into their understanding of the natural world, not as superstition but as practical ecology. And every institution Ward worked for, every journal he published in, every colleague he sat across from at conferences would have dismissed all of it as folklore. Something inside Ward shifted during those 3 days in the library. Not his commitment to data, not his scientific rigor, something deeper. An understanding that the institutional framework he had served his entire career was structurally incapable of accommodating certain categories of evidence, not because the evidence was weak, but because the categories themselves fell outside the boundaries of what the institution had decided was real. The USGS could measure ground deformation to a fraction of a millimeter. It could not process a report that something was calling in the dark along the fault trace before the ground moved. The tools were magnificent. The framework was blind. Ward continued his private documentation through the 2000s and into the 2010s. The dataset grew. The correlation held at 66%, as steady as a heartbeat. And the geographic pattern that emerged over decades was perhaps the most compelling feature of all. The vocalization events clustered in sections of the San Andreas, where the fault's behavior was most complex. The Parkfield Transition Zone, the Big Bend, the locked Carrizo segment, exactly the sections where precursor signals would theoretically be strongest. 83% of all documented events fell within the estimated fault damage zone, the band of shattered rock flanking the main trace, where precursor signals would be most intense and most detectable. Whatever these creatures were, they were not just living near the fault, they were living on it. The creatures were using the fault like a corridor, a home range defined not by vegetation or prey distribution, but by the geological structure of the Earth itself. If these beings were adapted to the unique conditions of the fault damage zone, they had been there for a very long time, not decades, not centuries. The kind of biological adaptation Ward was hypothesizing took millennia at minimum. Vicky found out in 2008. Not because Ward told her, because she found one of the moleskines. They had been married for 14 years. Vicky was a hydrologist who understood fieldwork and the particular silence that settles over scientists processing data. She gave Ward space. He valued that space perhaps more than he should have. One Saturday afternoon, she opened the wrong drawer of his workbench in the garage, looking for a screwdriver. Inside were two moleskines. She opened one expecting calibration notes. What she read was an entry from October of 2007 describing vocalizations at 2:15 in the morning near the Kolame Valley. Estimated fundamental frequency below 90 Hz. Bipedal movement detected approximately 200 yards west of camp. Correlation with a subsequent 3.6 magnitude event 31 hours later. The entry concluded with a paragraph analyzing the acoustic similarity between this event and 14 previous events, documented along the same fault segment over 16 years. Vicky read both notebooks, cover to cover. When Ward came in from the fence line, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the moleskines open in front of her. She did not yell. Vicky was not a person who yelled. She asked him to sit down, and then she asked him, in the measured voice she used when presenting unwelcome findings at agency meetings, how long he had been keeping these records. He told her since 1991. She asked why he had never told her. He gave her the answer he had been giving himself for 17 years, that the correlation connected legitimate geophysical phenomena to a subject that would destroy his career and hers by association, that he was protecting both of them, that he did not know how to explain what he was documenting without sounding like he had lost his mind. Vicky listened. Then she said something that cut through every rationalization Ward had built up over nearly 2 decades. She said, "Ward, I am a scientist. You married a scientist. If you had data that you thought was significant, data that you collected rigorously over 17 years, the person you should have brought it to first was me. Not because I am your wife, because I am qualified to evaluate it. You did not trust me with this, and I need to understand why." Ward did not have an answer that was good enough. The truth was that he had been afraid that telling Vicky would force him to either act on the data or abandon it, and he was not ready for either. The private notebooks had become a kind of parallel life, a contained space where the impossible correlation could exist without consequences. Telling Vicky would have collapsed that space. It would have made the data real in a way that demanded decisions. Vicky spent the following week reviewing Ward's full archive, all 17 years of Moleskines plus the master log in the filing cabinet. She brought her hydrologist's eye to the data, and she found things Ward had missed. She noticed that his vocalization entries showed a secondary correlation with groundwater level changes measured at USGS monitoring wells in the fault zone. Several of the wells Ward drove past on his way to field sites showed measurable drops in water level in the 48 to 72 hours before seismic events, a known precursor signal. When Vicky overlaid Ward's vocalization timing against the well data, she found that the vocalizations typically occurred after the groundwater changes but before the seismic event. The sequence was consistent: groundwater drop, vocalizations, earthquake, as if the creatures were responding to a precursor signal that preceded the earthquake but followed the hydrological changes. They were detecting something in the middle of the cascade after the initial stress changes altered groundwater flow, but before the accumulated stress released as seismic waves. That temporal sequencing was the first piece of evidence that moved the correlation from curiosity to mechanism. It suggested a specific sensory pathway. The creatures were not responding to the earthquake itself. They were responding to a precursor stage in the deformation sequence, a stage that current USGS instrumentation could measure but that nobody was using as a predictive indicator because nobody believed biological systems could detect it reliably. Except these creatures had been detecting it reliably for longer than the instruments had existed. Vicky told Ward she believed the data was significant and that it deserved formal investigation. Ward told her that formal investigation was impossible. They argued about it for 3 months. The arguments were not loud. They were the quiet, grinding kind that happen between two intelligent people who agree on the facts and disagree on what to do about them. Vicky wanted Ward to approach the problem the way a scientist should: design a controlled study, seek peer review, publish. Ward wanted to continue collecting data privately until the dataset was so large and the correlation so robust that it could survive the initial wave of ridicule that would follow publication. They were both right. They were both wrong. And the argument opened a fissure in their marriage that would widen over the next 13 years in ways neither of them anticipated. Vicky kept Ward's secret. She never told anyone at the USGS or anywhere else, but she carried it the way Ward had been carrying it, as an invisible weight that altered the shape of daily life in ways too subtle to name and too pervasive to ignore. She stopped asking Ward about his field deployments. She stopped reading his official field reports, which she had always done as a matter of professional interest. She did not visit the filing cabinet in the garage. The Moleskines existed in their marriage like a locked room that both of them knew was there, and neither could open without consequences they were not ready to face. The cost showed up in the margins, in conversations that ended a sentence too soon, in evenings where they sat in the same room with a distance between them that had nothing to do with the furniture. They loved each other, but the locked room was always there. And Ward knew that the room was larger for Vicky than it was for him because he had chosen to build it and she had only discovered it was there. In 2012, Ward received an email from a man named Len Driscoll, a retired California Highway Patrol officer who had spent 26 years patrolling rural highways across San Luis Obispo and Kern counties, the stretch of the San Andreas that includes the Carrizo Plain and Cholame. Len had come across a geophysics workshop presentation Ward had given in 2010, one that discussed seismic precursors in general terms without mentioning the biological component, and he reached out because he had something to tell a seismologist. Over 26 years of night patrols on Highway 46, Highway 58 across the Carrizo Plain, and Highway 166 through the Cuyama Valley, Len had accumulated experiences that he had never included in any CHP report because the CHP did not have a reporting category for what he had experienced. He had seen things on those roads, large figures crossing at night, shapes too tall and moving wrong for anything in the standard fauna. He had heard deep vocalizations from the rangeland that coyotes and mountain lions could not replicate. He had found elongated tracks on dirt shoulders with stride lengths, suggesting something walking upright with legs considerably longer than a man's. He had documented none of it officially. He kept his own spiral-bound notebook, the same way Ward kept his moleskines because he was the same kind of man. But the thing Len wanted to tell Ward was not about the sightings. It was about the timing. Over decades of night patrol, his sightings and vocalization reports clustered before earthquakes. Len was not a seismologist. He did not have precise timing data. What he had was 26 years of observational instinct, and his gut told him that the strangeness on those roads spiked before the ground moved. Ward drove to Atascadero to meet Len in person. They sat at a diner on El Camino Real for 4 hours. Ward showed Len his correlation data without revealing the full scope of his archive. Len showed Ward his patrol notebooks, which contained 143 entries, spanning more than 2 decades. When Ward compared Len's entries against the USGS seismic catalog for the same time period and region, the correlation was there. Not as clean as Ward's data because Len's observations were less precisely timed and his location data was approximate rather than GPS calibrated, but the pattern was unmistakable. Len's sightings and vocalizations clustered in the 48 to 72 hours before seismic events on the Carrizo and Cholam segments with a correlation rate of 58%, which was lower than Ward's 66%, but still well above what chance alone would predict. 2 independent observers, 2 different methodologies, 2 different professional backgrounds, the same pattern. The convergence of their datasets did something to Ward that years of private documentation had not accomplished. It made the pattern real in a way that private data could not. Ward's data alone could be dismissed as one man's obsession, confirmation bias dressed up in scientific notation. But Len Driscoll had no scientific training, no knowledge of seismic precursor theory, no reason to expect or look for a correlation. He had simply observed what happened and written it down, and what he wrote down matched what Ward had been documenting from a completely different angle for 2 decades. Len introduced Ward to someone else, a woman named Rosemary Uribe, who ran cattle on 1,200 acres in the Temblor Range, east of the Carrizo Plain. Rosemary's family had ranched that land for 4 generations, since her great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1904. She was 68 years old, weathered and direct, a woman who had spent her entire life on a landscape that most Californians did not know existed, and she had stories. Rosemary told Ward that her family had always known about what she called the ridge walkers, tall, dark, nocturnal, moving along the ridgelines of the Temblor Range in a territory that ran roughly parallel to the fault trace. Her grandfather had seen them, her father had seen them, she had seen them herself 5 times over the course of her life, always at dusk or after dark, always on the skyline of the eastern ridges. She did not fear them. She regarded them the way she regarded mountain lions, as a fact of the landscape, something to be aware of and respectful of, but not something that required action unless it threatened the herd. The ridgewalkers had never bothered her cattle, as far as she knew. They kept to the high country. They moved at night. They stayed out of sight. But Rosemary confirmed something that made Ward's hands go cold when she said it. She said the ridgewalkers called before the shaking. She said it casually, the way you would mention that the barn swallows arrived every March. The ridge walkers called before the shaking. Her grandfather had told her that. Her father had told her that. She had observed it herself multiple times over a lifetime on that land. When the deep calls came from the ridges at night, you checked your stock and your fences because the ground was going to move within a day or two. Ward sat in Rosemary Uribe's kitchen, drinking bitter coffee from a chipped mug, and listened to a fourth-generation rancher describe the same correlation he had been secretly documenting for 21 years. Described it not as discovery but as common knowledge, as something her family had known for a century, as something the land itself told you if you lived on it long enough to listen. He asked Rosemary if she had ever told anyone outside her family. She looked at him with an expression that combined amusement and weariness in equal measure and said, "Mr. Torrance, who would I tell? The BLM people who come through twice a year and do not know a heifer from a steer. The county extension agent who thinks I am quaint. The earthquake scientists who plant their instruments on my land and never ask me what I know about the ground they are measuring." She said no one had ever asked her, not in 68 years of living on the San Andreas Fault, had a single scientist, journalist, or government official asked a rancher whose family had occupied that land for a century what she knew about how the earth behaved before it moved. They planted their instruments and read their data and treated the landscape like an equation rather than a place where people lived and paid attention and accumulated knowledge across generations. That was the moment Ward understood the full architecture of the silence he had been part of. It was not just institutional blindness toward an inconvenient species. It was institutional deafness toward an entire category of knowledge. Rosemary Uribe and her family had been observing the San Andreas Fault continuously for 100 years, longer than any instrument network, longer than any research program, longer than the USGS itself. Their observations included biological indicators that correlated with seismic events in exactly the way that the abandoned precursor research of the 1970s had theorized was possible. But because those observations involved a species that official science refused to acknowledge, and because the observers were ranchers rather than credentialed researchers, the knowledge simply did not exist as far as the institutional world was concerned. It was invisible, not hidden, not suppressed, just invisible, the way anything is invisible when the system looking for it does not have the capacity to see it. And then Ward did the math. Not the cautious statistical math of correlation coefficients, the urgent math, the math that asks how many people live on top of a fault that something else can feel moving. Between 1991 and 2021, the San Andreas Fault system produced 11 earthquakes of magnitude 5 or greater in the sections Ward had been monitoring. His data showed that 9 of those 11 were preceded by vocalization events within the 72-hour window, 9 out of 11, an 82% detection rate for the most dangerous class of events. If that detection rate held across the full length of the fault, if it was not an artifact of sample size or geographic specificity, it represented a biological early warning system for earthquakes that was more reliable than anything the USGS had ever developed through instrumental monitoring alone. Consider what that means, not in terms of the species producing the vocalizations. Set aside what they are for a moment. Think only about what their behavior represents. A naturally occurring, self-sustaining biological network distributed along the most dangerous fault system in the continental United States, producing detectable signals in advance of significant seismic events. A network that required no instruments, no maintenance, no funding, no calibration. A network that had been operational for thousands of years before any human institution existed. A network that Ward Torrance had been documenting in secret for 3 decades because the professional consequences of acknowledging its existence were more frightening to him than the earthquakes it predicted. The next significant event happened in 2014. The South Napa earthquake, magnitude 6.0, struck on August 24th. It injured over 200 people and caused significant structural damage. 4 days before the Napa earthquake, Len Driscoll had called Ward to report something unusual on the Carrizo Plain. Over the previous 48 hours, Len had heard vocalizations on 3 separate occasions near Soda Lake. 3 events in 48 hours was unprecedented. His normal rate was 1 or 2 per month during the active season. The Napa earthquake occurred on the West Napa Fault, not the San Andreas directly. But the West Napa Fault is part of the broader San Andreas system, a network of interconnected fractures that transfer stress between segments. The Carrizo Plain sits on one of the most critically stressed segments. Were the creatures responding to a stress signal that propagated through the fault system before the Napa rupture? The data point was ambiguous, but it opened a staggering possibility. If these beings were sensitive not just to local precursors, but to stress changes propagating through the interconnected fault network, they were not just local sensors, they were nodes in a system. A biological seismograph distributed across hundreds of miles of active fault. Ward spent the fall of 2014 reanalyzing his entire dataset with this regional perspective. What he found was that 10 of his 130 vocalization entries, previously classified as blank events with no associated seismicity, actually preceded seismic events on connected fault segments rather than the local segment where the vocalization occurred. When he included these regional correlations, the positive correlation rate rose from 66 to 74%. The creatures were detecting stress changes that originated hundreds of miles away and arrived through the deep structure of the crust. He told Vicky. He showed her the analysis. She sat at his workbench in the garage, where the filing cabinet now held 23 years of moleskines, and she read through his calculations without speaking. When she finished, she said 3 words: "You have to publish." Ward said he could not. Vicky said he had to. They had this argument again, louder this time. Not about the science, but about the moral dimensions of sitting on data that could save lives. Vicky did not use the word selfish. She did not need to. The word hung in the garage like a sound neither of them had produced. They did not speak about it again for months. The silence around the silence grew. Vicky began spending more weekends at a friend's house in Santa Cruz. Ward noticed. He did not ask about it. They were becoming 2 people who lived in the same house and were exquisitely careful not to disturb the things they had both agreed not to touch. Ward retired from the USGS in 2021. 34 years of service, a retirement lunch, a plaque, a handshake from the director, and a cardboard box of desk items. He drove home with the box on the passenger seat and 30 years of correlations that no one in that building had ever heard of. Vicky moved out 6 months later. She took a position with a water district in Santa Barbara. Ward understood it was more than a career opportunity. They did not divorce formally. Vicky simply needed distance from the locked room, and Ward could not blame her because the locked room had become the house itself. Everything in their shared life had been shaped by what Ward could not say, and after 30 years, the shape of the silence had become the shape of the marriage. Ward sat alone in the Los Gatos house through the winter of 21 into 22. He had the filing cabinet, he had the moleskines, he had 30 years of data showing that something was alive along the San Andreas Fault and was responding to the Earth's movements with a consistency and sensitivity that rivaled any instrument the USGS had ever deployed. And he had no idea what to do with any of it. What moved him to act was a news article. In March of 2022, the USGS published an updated hazard assessment for the southern San Andreas. raising the 30-year probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater earthquake to approximately 75%. The assessment used GPS deformation data, historical seismicity, paleoseismic trench studies, fault geometry modeling. It did not mention biological indicators. It treated the San Andreas as a physical system to be modeled with instruments, with no acknowledgement that the most dangerous fault in California had been instrumented by biology for millennia before a single seismometer was installed. Ward thought about a magnitude 7, about the cities in the hazard zone, San Bernardino, Palmdale, millions of people. He thought about his 82% detection rate for events of magnitude 5 and above, a 72-hour window, 3 days of warning, and he thought about the 30 years he had spent keeping that data in his garage while people slept on top of a fault that something else could feel coming. He called Len Driscoll first, then Rosemary Uribe. He told them both what he was planning to do. Len said it was about time. Rosemary said she would tell Ward the same thing she told every earthquake scientist who ever planted an instrument on her land. Ask the land. The land already knows. Ward published his findings in May of 2023 on a personal website, accompanied by the complete dataset digitized and geocoded, every correlation calculated, every null event included. Len's patrol notebooks and Rosemary's family oral history, published with permission. 4 field recordings with spectral analysis showing harmonically complex vocalizations matching no catalog species. Everything made public. The response was what he had predicted. From the institutional world, silence. His former USGS colleagues did not respond. The seismological journals did not request the data. From the public, a brief flare of sensational media attention that cycled through and disappeared within weeks. But Ward received 12 emails that mattered. 12 people in different locations along the San Andreas who had their own observations. A park ranger in the San Gabriel Mountains with 9 years of documented vocalizations near the fault trace. A retired Caltrans engineer who had noticed wildlife behavior patterns before seismic events at bridge crossings in the transverse ranges. A Chumash cultural liaison who said her people had been trying to tell geologists this for 50 years. A Cholame Valley rancher whose grandfather had said the same thing Rosemary's grandfather said. The calls come before the shaking. 4 of the 12 had independently documented vocalizations in the fault zone and noticed the seismic correlation on their own. 12 nodes, 12 independent observers scattered along 750 miles of the most dangerous fault system in North America, each one holding a piece of the same picture, each one silent until Ward broke the silence first. The geographic distribution of those 12 respondents traced the fault like a dotted line from the Salton Sea to the San Francisco Peninsula. 12 people spread across 750 miles, all reporting the same phenomenon. When Ward mapped those reports alongside his own data and Len's records and Rosemary's family history and the indigenous accounts from the Bancroft Library, the overlay was remarkable. The vocalization reports clustered along the same fault segments, concentrated in the same damage zones, showed the same temporal relationship with seismicity. The pattern was not Ward's pattern, it was the fault's pattern. Think about what that means for a moment, not about the species, about the data, about the fact that a naturally occurring early warning system for the most dangerous fault in the continental United States has been documented independently by indigenous peoples, by ranchers, by law enforcement, and by at least one credentialed geophysicist across more than a century of observation, and the institutional response has been silence. Not because the data is weak, because the source of the data is unacceptable. The USGS will not evaluate biological precursor evidence from a species it does not acknowledge exists. The seismological community will not review a dataset that requires accepting Bigfoot as a premise. The framework cannot accommodate the evidence, so the evidence does not exist within the framework. And the millions of people who live along the San Andreas continue to lack access to a detection capability that biology figured out thousands of years before anyone invented a seismometer. Ward still lives in Los Gatos. Vicky calls every few weeks. They talk about groundwater and fault mechanics and sometimes about nothing at all. The kind of conversation that happens between people who have shared a life and can no longer share a house. He does not ask her to come back. She does not offer. The locked room still stands between them, emptied now but not demolished. And the space where it used to be is a different kind of silence than the one that preceded it. Len Driscoll drives the back roads of San Luis Obispo County at night sometimes, the way he did for 26 years in uniform, except now he does it in his own truck with the windows down and a digital recorder on the dashboard. He captures what he captures and sends the files to Ward without comment. The fault does not care whether anyone is listening officially. It moves on its own schedule, and the things that live along it call when they feel it building, the way they have always called, indifferent to whether a retired CHP officer with a digital recorder is the only one paying attention. Rosemary Uribe still runs cattle in the Temblor Range. She told Ward the last time he visited that she heard the ridgewalkers calling on a Tuesday night in November, and that the ground shook the following Thursday, a 3.9 near Coalinga. She told him this the way she would tell him about rainfall totals or calf weights, as data points in a life lived close to the ground. And somewhere along the San Andreas Fault, in the fault damage zones where the rock is shattered and the stress accumulates and the precursor signals propagate through fractured geology in the hours before release, something is awake. Something that has been awake along this fault for longer than any human civilization in the Western Hemisphere. Something that feels the changes in the rock and the water and the electromagnetic field with a sensitivity that makes a broadband seismometer look like a toy. Something that calls out in the dark when the pressure builds, producing sounds that carry through the empty rangeland and the dry canyons and the scrub oak hillsides, with a resonance that vibrates in the chest of anyone close enough to hear it. Calls that Yokuts elders described to ethnographers 100 years ago. Calls that Rosemary Uribe's great-grandfather heard from the same ridgelines where she hears them now. Calls that Ward Torrance documented in Moleskine notebooks for 30 years while the institution he worked for measured the same fault with instruments that could detect a millimeter of ground deformation but could not accommodate the possibility that something alive was doing the same job better. The San Andreas Fault is locked. The southern section has not produced a major earthquake since 1700 and something, more than 300 years of accumulated strain on a fault that has historically ruptured every 150. The next big one is not a question of if. The seismologists agree on that. It is a question of when. And when the stress reaches the threshold, when the rock begins its final cascade of micro-fracturing and fluid migration and electromagnetic change in the hours before rupture, something along that fault will know. Something will feel it coming the way it has always felt it coming. And it will call out in the dark the way it has always called. The question Ward Torrance cannot stop asking, the question that follows him from his desk to his porch, to his bed where he lies awake, listening to the Santa Cruz Mountains settle in the dark, is whether anyone will be listening when it does. Whether the next great San Andreas earthquake will be preceded by the same biological signal that has preceded events for thousands of years, heard by the creatures that produce it, and ignored by every institution with the power to act on it. Whether the cost of institutional blindness, the cost of refusing to see what does not fit the framework, will finally be measured not in damaged careers and broken marriages, but in lives. He does not know. He sits with the not knowing the way he has sat with it for 30 years, alone with data that is too rigorous to dismiss and too uncomfortable to accept. In a house where the filing cabinet in the garage is no longer a secret, and the marriage it helped erode is no longer whole, and the fault beneath his feet is still locked and still accumulating and still waiting. The Moleskines are publicly available now. The correlations can be checked by anyone with access to the USGS seismic catalog. The recordings are posted. The indigenous accounts are cited. Lens patrol logs are documented. Rosemary's family history is on the record. 12 independent observers along 750 miles of the most dangerous fault in North America have contributed their pieces of the same pattern. Ward Torrance did not discover something new. He documented something old, something that the Yokuts and the Chumash and the Esalen knew, something that ranchers like Rosemary Uribe's family knew from a century of paying attention, something that a highway patrol officer noticed from 26 years of driving the same roads at night. The ground is not quiet. It has never been quiet, and neither are the things that live on it. The fault is still there, 750 miles of fractured rock that will move again because it has always moved. And along its length, in the damage zones where the rock speaks in frequencies too low for human ears, something is still listening, still calling when the pressure builds, the way it has for longer than any record we possess. The only question that remains is whether the next time it calls, someone on the other end will finally be willing to hear it.